tax proposal.
Mr. President, as I think everyone knows, the President of the United States, President Obama, and the Republican leadership have reached an agreement on a very significant tax bill. In my view, the agreement that they reached is a bad deal for the American people. I think we can do better. And I am here today to take a strong stand against this bill. And I intend to tell my colleagues and the nation exactly why I am in opposition to this bill. You can call what I'm doing today whatever you want. You can call it a filibuster. You can call it a very long speech. I'm not here to set any great records or to make a spectacle. I am simply here today to take as long as I can to explain to the American people the fact that we have got to do a lot better than this agreement provides. Now let me just enumerate some of the reasons that I am opposed to this agreement. First, as everybody knows, this nation has a record-breaking $13.8 trillion national debt at the same time as the middle class is collapsing and poverty is increasing. And Mr. President, I think it's important that we say a word, because I'm not sure that a lot of Americans necessarily know this, about how we got to where we are today in terms of the national debt. I know there are some people who think that this all began the day that President Obama took office. Well, it's not quite the case. When President Clinton left office, this country was running, in fact, a very significant surplus, and the projections were that we were going to continue to run a surplus. During the 8 years of President Bush, for a number of reasons, including the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, including huge tax breaks for the wealthiest people in this country, including a Medicare Part D prescription drug program, and including the Wall Street bailout, among other things, all of which were not paid for. Those are the primary reasons that we saw an almost doubling of the national debt during the Bush administration. And since President Obama has been in office, we have passed a stimulus package, also adding to the deficit in national debt. But here we are today with a $13.8 trillion national debt, $1.4 trillion deficit, and almost all Americans are in agreement that this is a very serious issue. So the first point that I would make is that it seems to me to be unconscionable for my conservative friends and for everybody else in this country to be driving up this already too high national debt by giving tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires who don't need it, and in a number of cases, Mr. President, don't even want it. Here's one of the interesting ironies. There are lists of many, many very wealthy people who've come forward and say, sure, I want a tax break. Everybody wants a tax break. But you know what? There are other priorities in this country. I don't need it. And two of the wealthiest people in the world, Bill Gates of Microsoft, Warren Buffett, Berkshire, these are billionaires, and they said it's absurd. We don't need a tax break. And all over the country, you're hearing a lot of folks who have a lot of money saying, don't drive up the deficit and force our kids to pay higher taxes to pay off the national debt in order to give tax breaks to the richest people in this country. Now, Mr. President, we have been told really not to worry too much because the extension of these tax breaks for the wealthy will only last 2 years. Not to worry. Well, maybe that's the case. But given the political reality that I have seen in Washington, my guess is that 2 years from now, these tax breaks for the wealthiest people in this country will be extended again. What happens around here is that the argument will be made that if you end these tax breaks, you're raising taxes. It's what we're hearing right now. I see no reason why in the middle of a presidential election those arguments will not be made again, and I see no reason not to believe that those tax breaks will be extended again. And clearly we have a number of Republicans who want to make that extension permanent. Now, whether it will ever be made permanent or not, I don't know. But the point is, when you hear folks say that it's only a 2-year extension, I would suggest take that with a grain of salt. And let me just say that if, in fact, we do what the Republicans have wanted to do right now, as we enter this debate, they wanted a 10-year extension. That would add $700 billion to our national debt, $700 billion. Now, I've got 4 kids, and I've got 6 grandchildren. And I think it is grossly unfair. None of them have a whole lot of money. I think it is grossly unfair to ask my kids and grandchildren and the children all over this country to be paying higher taxes in order to provide tax breaks for billionaires because we've driven up the national debt. That is just plain wrong. And Mr. President, I think the vast majority of the American people, whether they're progressives like myself or whether they're conservatives, I think they perceive that that concept, that giving tax breaks to billionaires when we have such a high national debt, makes no sense at all. Furthermore, Mr. President, it is important to point out that extending income tax breaks to the top 2% is not the only unfair tax proposal in this agreement. This agreement between the President and the Republican leadership also calls for a continuation of the Bush-era 15% tax rate on capital gains and dividends, meaning that those people who make their living off their investments will continue to pay a substantially lower tax rate than firemen, teachers, nurses, carpenters, and virtually all the other working people of this country. And I just don't think that that's fair. That's wrong. And we are continuing, if this agreement were to be passed, that unfair arrangement. Mr. President, on top of all of that, this agreement includes a horrendous proposal regarding the estate tax. And that is a Teddy Roosevelt initiative. Teddy Roosevelt was talking about this in the early years of the 20th century. It was enacted in 1916. And it was enacted for a couple of reasons. Teddy Roosevelt and the people of that era thought it was wrong that a handful of people could have a huge concentration of wealth and then just give that wealth, transmit that wealth to their children. He didn't think that that was right. Furthermore, it was a source, a progressive and fair source of revenue. Under the agreement struck between the Republican leadership and the President, the estate tax rate, which was 55% under President Clinton, and let's all remember, we had problems with the economy under President Clinton, but very few will deny that during those years we were creating a heck of a lot more jobs than we did under President Bush. That's the fact. Over 20 million jobs under President Clinton. We lost 600,000 private sector jobs under President Bush. During the Clinton era, the tax rate on the estate tax was 55%. What this arrangement would do is lower that tax rate to 35% with an exemption on the first $5 million of an individual's estate, $10 million for couples. Now, here's the important point, Mr. President, that I think many people don't know, because I have to confess, my Republican friends and their pollsters and their language people have done a very good job. This is the so-called death tax. And I think all over America, people are saying, oh, this is terrible. I have $50,000 in the bank and I want to leave that to my kids. And the government is going to take 55% of that, 35% of that. What an outrage. So let us be very, very clear. This tax applies only to the top 0.3% of American families. 99.7% of American families will not pay one nickel in an estate tax. This is not a tax on the rich. This is a tax on the very, very, very rich. And if my Republican friends had been successful in doing what they want to do, which is eliminating this estate tax completely, it would have cost, Mr. President, our Treasury, raised the national debt by $1 trillion over a 10-year period. Families like the Walton family of Walmart fame would have received, as one family, about a $30 billion tax break. So I find it hard to believe that when we are talking about massive cuts in programs for working families, when we have this huge national debt, that anybody would be agreeing to lower the estate tax rate to 35%. That is what this agreement does, and I think that that is a very, very bad idea. And once again, while the agreement on the estate tax is for 2 years, once again, there is very little doubt in my mind that the Republicans will continue to push for lower and lower estate tax rates because what they want, and I think Senator Kyle has been pretty clear about this, they want to permanently repeal that tax. That is $1 trillion in tax breaks to the top 0.3%. So I think we're down a bad path there, and that's another reason why this agreement does not make a whole lot of sense. Mr. President, I would say thirdly, and here's a very important point that I think has not yet gotten the attention that it deserves, and that is this agreement contains a payroll tax holiday, which would cut $120 billion from Social Security payroll taxes for workers. And I think there are a lot of folks out there who say, well, this is pretty good. You know, I'm a worker. My contribution will go from 6.2% today down to 4.2%. I'll have more money in my paycheck. It's a good idea. Let's take a deep breath and let's think about it for a second. Let's understand what this whole thing is about. This payroll tax holiday concept, as I understand it, originally started with conservative Republicans. And I know the Vice President recently made the point this was originally a Republican idea. Now, why did the Republicans come up with this idea? Well, these are exactly the same people who don't believe in Social Security. These are the same people who either want to make significant cuts in Social Security or else they want to privatize Social Security entirely. And here's the point. They understand that if we divert funding that is supposed to go into the Social Security Trust Fund, which is what this payroll tax holiday does. This is money that goes into the Social Security Trust Fund is now being diverted, cut back, in order to provide financial support for workers. But that is a lot of money not going into the trust fund. Now, what the President and others are saying, well, not to worry, because that money will be covered by the general fund. That is a very, very bad and dangerous precedent, because up until now, what Social Security has been about is 100% funding from payroll contributions, not from the general tax base. Now, once again, this is a one-year program. The loss of revenue going into Social Security can be covered by the general fund. But we have a $13 trillion national debt. How much longer will the general fund put money into Social Security? Is it a good idea for the general fund to be doing that? So I would argue, Mr. President, that this is not a good idea. This is a very dangerous step forward for those of us who believe in Social Security. But this is not just Bernie Sanders saying this. Mr. President, one of the more effective and I think important senior groups in America is called the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. They have, I don't know exactly how many, but they have many, many members all over this country. I know they're active in the state of Vermont. And I want to read to you from a press release that they just sent out the other day. And this is the headline on it, from the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. Cutting contributions to Social Security signals the beginning of the end. Payroll tax holiday is anything but. And this is what they say. This comes from now Barbara Kennelly. Barbara used to serve in the House of Representatives. I've known Barbara for years. She's now the president and CEO of the National Committee to Preserve Social Security, one of the strong senior groups in America. And this is what Barbara says, and I quote, "Even though Social Security contributed nothing to the current economic crisis, it has been bartered in a deal that provides deficit-busting tax cuts for the wealthy. Diverting $120 billion in Social Security contributions for a so-called tax holiday may sound like a good deal for workers now, but it's bad business for the program that a majority of middle-class seniors will rely upon in the future." And that's what the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare says about that agreement, and I agree with them. So for all of us who understand that Social Security is life and death for tens of millions of Americans today and will be vitally important for working people as they reach retirement age, that we understand that Social Security has done a great job. You know, Mr. President, a few minutes ago you were on the floor talking about the strong work that our federal employees do, and you're absolutely